pretend they didn't see it. And it's that thing that often makes people come forward. Sure, there's people that are mercenary, and they look for the monetary reward associated with it. Sometimes it's payback for someone who's wronged them, or payback for or a sense of making things. People are getting promoted because they're doing illegal activity, and they don't feel good about that, so they want to expose it. Sometimes they report because they don't want to be implicated in wrongdoing that's near them. But the number one thing that I see is that something about it hits them personally, and they couldn't imagine not reporting. And that's why you see whistleblowers who, after the fact, are asked, would you do it again? Even when they had bad outcomes or challenges, and they say yes. And the reason they say yes is because they can't imagine a world where they didn't speak up about this particular thing. And for me, that's one of the reasons that my clients are heroes, is that in the face of these challenges, the known challenges that whistleblowers face, they're willing to come forward anyway.
Now, without disclosing specific cases, generally, what are some of the types of behavior they're reporting?
Oh, right. Types of violations. So there are a number of types. The securities laws are broad, and they cover all kind of forms of fraud and deception. But the kind of standard ones that the SEC regularly polices are corporate disclosures and reporting violations, sometimes called accounting violations, trading violations, insider trading, bribery in the form of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, offering frauds. There's obviously today there's cryptocurrency scams, and there's public people raising public funds, but it all often comes down to fraud and deception in the where people are raising money or engaging in financial investment.
So let me backtrack a bit. Cryptocurrency. I know enough to be dangerous, and I don't know that much about it. Does the SEC play a role in any of that?
Well, that's an emerging area where there's a big debate in Congress and at the SEC about where their jurisdiction ends and other agencies take over. But currently, the kind of where the SEC stands is you have to be registered as a security if you are if you're one of the cryptocurrencies, and so a lot of these currencies failed to register, and there's been enforcement actions against them for failing to register as a security. The second sort of area that the SEC has been policing is outright frauds, where a cryptocurrency is saying they're doing one thing, but they're really doing another thing. And that's a classic sort of SEC case where you're saying one thing and you're doing something else. Someone came to me recently and was talking about a particular coin offering where they were telling people that the pre-offering price was blank, and it was always blank, but they kept raising it and taking some of the profits. Okay, that's a fraud, and the SEC is going to move on that company, and it doesn't matter if they needed to register or not register. It's just they're taking people's money under false pretenses.
Now, when I'm an attorney. I practiced for almost 20 years. And there's different kinds of law for those watching. And, they may not be aware, there's administrative law, there's civil law, there's criminal law. What's the intersection? When I hear fraud, I hear civil, and I hear criminal, or, I hear civil, administrative, and criminal. What's the intersection of these cases with the criminal justice system, if at all?
It's frequent, is the answer. And the most significant cases often have both a a SEC, which is a civil sort of enforcement process, and then the DOJ or criminal processes that work in parallel with the SEC. So the most significant cases, the ones that have the most corroboration, are the ones where you see both DOJ and the SEC being involved. There are a few areas of law where there's just a very close collaboration. For instance, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act cases. You almost always see an SEC and a DOJ case brought at the same time. So there's some areas where it's very frequent that they work together, and sometimes it's just the significance of the case.
And can you talk a little bit about the process and how it works in general terms? Somebody comes to you and reports that they're aware of something that might be an SEC violation, and they want to blow the whistle.
Sure. So people come to us in different ways. Most often, it's a phone call, and our initial approach is to assume that what they're saying is true. And then we ask the question, is it a securities violation? Is it significant? Is it well corroborated? And if they sort of clear that hurdle, then we want to know more. And we will do due diligence on them, because we are essentially vouching for them with law enforcement. So we want to be sure that we know everything about them. We do due diligence on their allegations, both legally and factually. And depending on the case, depending on how much evidence they have, we may want to add evidence by using investigators and experts to kind of further build their case. But at some point, we're going to have a critical mass of evidence that we want to bring to law enforcement authorities, and then we file. And then once we do that, we are invited in to talk to the SEC, sometimes the SEC and DOJ, and we educate them on what we know. They often have follow-up questions, and then we will work with them as their case goes forward. And then down the road, there's a successful enforcement action, and then we are more active again in putting together an application for award where we document all the great work that our clients did.
And so it's not like filing a lawsuit in state or federal court, the work that you do. You're making a report to law enforcement and to an agency, or just to law enforcement?
You're right. It's unlike the False Claims Act or key TAM cases, where you file and you have an independent right of action. In the SEC, CFTC, and IRS contexts, you file, and then only the government has the right to bring that action. And so you are a supporting player in their work, as opposed to a principal.
When should someone consider becoming a whistleblower?
I think that people should consider being a whistleblower early on. That's very different than deciding to blow the whistle. But I think that clients that have the best outcomes are the people that have spent the most time thinking about and strategizing on how to report, whom to report to, and to develop their case. The people that have the most challenging times are people that are put into a situation where they need to act immediately. They have less ability to kind of navigate the challenging situation that they're in.
Can you give a sort of a practical example of what that might look like for folks that might not understand?
Sure. So one of the questions is that whistleblowers face is, am I right? There's a problem, but they're not sure that it constitutes a violation of law. And so they would be wise to consult with an attorney, an advocacy organization, or some other way to document that there is actually a problem. And then if they're comfortable that there's a problem, then do they have evidence that they could present to go forward. And then, of course, there's a bigger question, which is, in weighing the pros and cons of coming forward, are they willing to take that risk? And there's a related sort of thing that they have to think about, which is, what is my goal here? Is my goal to jam up a bad guy? Is my goal to collect an award? Do I want to remain in the organization? And that's something that people don't appreciate. They think that, well, if you're going to report on them, of course you don't want to stay there. But for many people, the organization they work in is their family, their home, their friendships. And so the idea of leaving there is difficult. And so you have to weigh all these things. And sometimes the answer is there's wrongdoing. You have evidence, but the consequences of reporting are too heavy, and they're not willing to go forward. And as a former law enforcement person, it's really tough, because I now know about a wrongdoing that's impacting investors, but the whistleblower deserves straight talk, and they've been given straight talk, and they've chosen not to go forward. And now I need to know, I have to carry the fact that I know this, and I can't say anything about it or do anything about it.
So I want to delve a little bit more into what steps, what people who are about to blow the whistle should do, and what steps they should take generally when they're faced with a situation that may suggest blowing the whistle.
Okay. Well, so let me try to give you a kind of step-by-step process. I think the first is familiarize yourself with your rights under both employment protections, but also if you were interested in, for instance, the SEC Whistleblower program, you'd want to understand what are the steps associated with that program. I would attempt to identify and confirm the existence of the problem, because sometimes people only have awareness of part of the problem, and that you're going to sleep better at night, and you're going to be assuming less risk if you're right. You want to be right. Even though the law only requires you to have a good faith belief, you want to be right. You want to be realistic about the risks and rewards. Sometimes people tell me, I'm right, and they're going to settle in a week because this is such a big deal. And I have to tell them, nothing happens in a week. And it's not, and they may not settle, because if for them to settle on this means they have to admit everything. And there's collateral consequences, so they're not going to settle right away. So the other thing is they want to consider legally collecting corroborating evidence, because once you've gotten to the point where you want to go forward, you want to be able to have the best chance of a successful investigation and the greatest possible award. But you have to do it legally. And there are a lot of ways to do it right, and there's a lot of ways to do it wrong, and there are a few ways to do it right. And that's where consulting with, again, an advocacy organization, an attorney, or if you're quite capable, doing your own research. And I think that the last thing that I would kind of tell people is to consider the different ways to disclose information. There are ways in which people can disclose information that, like the Ukrainian whistleblower in Congress. Put aside whatever political leanings you may have, the legal team that advised the Ukrainian whistleblower were very effective in ensuring that he did not or she did not violate the law, and that the person's name was not officially ever released. And if the goal is to get the truth out, that was a good strategy in that situation. Sometimes the good strategy is to go to a reporter. Sometimes a good strategy is to go to your anonymous hotline. But thinking about how to tell your story and what to put forth. We've spent a lot of time with our clients looking at, if we provide this information, will they identify you? Where should we send this information if we do send it? Is it instead of sending the information, can we suggest that they talk to a particular person who would tell them something? So there's different ways to advance your objectives. But the starting point for many people is, what is your goal? What are you called to do?
Are there lots of attorneys that handle SEC cases, or is this a real niche specialty?
It is a niche specialty. I joke with my wife that I'm a big fish in a puddle, because there's not many people who do what I do, but there are people who do this work, and I think that whistleblowers are wise to get people who are specialized in whistleblowing, because there are so many ways to have a misstep, and I think that that's something that people would be wise to want to avoid, and have someone who's helped them navigate it. So, for instance, if you have a national securities whistleblower, you want to find the people that helped that Ukrainian whistleblower, because those people are going to be really effective. There are a number of very effective attorneys that have assisted some of the Me Too whistleblowers, and you've seen how they've successfully navigated these clients through these difficult situations. I would recommend that people find someone like that if that's the kind of situation that they're facing.
Now, as we discussed prior to the show starting, there are lots of folks who watch this program, and they range in their background. Some folks are just average consumers, some folks are television producers, some are lawyers. And there's probably some lawyers watching for sure. So what are some traps for the unwary lawyer that they should be aware of when representing whistleblowers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you need to understand your potential client's motivations and help them to be realistic, assess any credibility and bias that may have, and ensure that they're aware of the different reporting avenues. I would set expectations early, that it's not always easy, glamorous, or lucrative to be a whistleblower, that the odds are long. You basically have less than 1/3% of people who report are successful in the SEC whistleblower program, and so that's why it's so important to be sure that you're right, to be sure it's significant, the thing you want to report is significant, that it's well corroborated. They need to be patient, because the process takes 2 to 4 years for the SEC to investigate, and 2 to 3 years to pay out an award. So this is like a 4 to 7 year process, and so people need to go in with their eyes open. I think lawyers should do good due diligence. They need to be looking at the statute of limitations. Is it material? The corroboration. They have to assess potential liability, because sometimes people who bring information think that they're going to get amnesty because they came forward, but they don't. They actually could be reporting on a problem and also inviting people to prosecute them. So you have to kind of focus on that. And I also think that you have to know yourself, because the representation of whistleblowers is unique in the law. It is a very personal relationship. Our clients can't talk with almost anybody else about this, and you have to really like your clients. You have to think about them as in a different way. I talk with my colleagues about what I call the guest bedroom rule, that if your client got jammed up and needed a place to stay for 2 weeks, would you let them stay in your guest bedroom? Because if you wouldn't let them stay in your guest bedroom, you don't want them as a client, because you're going to be professionally married to them for 7 years. And so you want to feel like these are people. And early on, I didn't appreciate that. I was more focused on, was it significant? And was it well corroborated? And those are a long 5 years. So you want to kind of be sure that you're not marrying crazy, or marrying someone who is going to be a difficult client.
That guest bedroom rule, that is one that I've never heard, and I wish I had heard early on in my career. I really do, because I think that applies across every practice area there is. That's fabulous.
Sure.
Um,
No, you probably have heard of the idea of, to hire someone, would you be willing to go on a business trip with them? You know what I mean? But with clients that you're with for 5 to 7 years, you need a little bit more than just a 2-day business trip rule. You need a guest bedroom rule.
oh my goodness, that's just a really great way of thinking about it. So as you know, I interviewed Tom Mueller, who wrote the book Crisis of Conscience Whistleblowing in the Age of Fraud. It's a mouthful, but it's a great book. And
I've read it. It's fantastic.
it's fantastic. And I asked him a question, and Tom being Tom, he astutely said that I should pose it to you.
Uh-oh.
So, so with fair warning that I was a cynical lawyer when I started, I'm more cynical now.
Mm-hmm.
But as a baby lawyer, and for a long time after that, I subscribed to the idea that the legal system in holding bad actors accountable would lead to a better world. But my observations are that companies are settling out of court, organizations are turning to arbitration to hide public process that a court affords plaintiffs, that the federal government has enacted a law related to arbitration that has been challenging for employment lawyers, but not impossible to overcome. And then there are these non-disclosure agreements and similar techniques to tamp down on public disclosure. And now there are these programs like this SEC program, but I'm not seeing the impact of changing behaviors. I mean, it seems as if every day I turn on the television or listen to the radio, and there's a new crisis, a new bad act by a large business. Do you believe in the greater good that these processes serve, or do you frame it differently? Are you seeing changes that I'm not aware of?
So I do think I think about it differently. You know, I am a realist, and there are a great deal of imperfections in our legal system. There's differential justice, and civil settlements are often paid for by the shareholders or the insurance company, not the senior people. Um, you know, Jamie Dimon is not concerned about having to pay another several $100 million for the next scandal that hits J.P. Morgan, because he doesn't pay for it, and his salary keeps going up and up. But, and this is the but that I think is so important, is that even in a world where the system isn't working the way we want it to, we have two choices: to accept it or fight. And what my clients do, what I do, what people like me do, is we fight the good fight. So I want to bring another case against Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan. They paid $267 million because of one of my clients, and I'm coming back because I want that to expose the wrongdoing at JP Morgan and all the other Wall Street firms that are doing bad things. I don't know if it's going to make the long-term difference, but I know that the other option is untenable. We cannot accept a world where corruption runs rampant. Something has to give. And I get peace in doing something about it. And I also feel good that I level the playing field for whistleblowers so that they can do it without having personal and professional regrets. And that's kind of how I look at it.
What do you want folks watching this program to understand about whistleblowers and whistleblowing that they might not understand that we haven't covered?
Well, I'll reframe the question just a little bit. Why am I here, and what I hope for is that I hope that more people choose to speak up about wrongdoing in one way or another, so that the bad guys can't keep doing it. And I know that for some people, they will think about that in the terms of, I can't imagine being a whistleblower. You don't have to be a whistleblower. You could support an anti-corruption organization or a whistleblower support organization, or you could hire someone who is a public whistleblower, who's a good person, who's an expert in what they do. But do something that supports the greater good and the anti-corruption efforts or the missions that these people were trying to advance. So if you're an environmentalist and but you don't know anything that you can blow the whistle on, maybe you support Transparency International or the National Whistleblower Center, which has a program to expose people who are mistreating animals. Do something to fight back or help people who are fighting back.
What do you want whistleblowers and the organizations that they work for to understand?
I think that for whistleblowers, I want them to understand that it's not always easy, glamorous, or lucrative to be a whistleblower. But it is possible to be a successful whistleblower. Because the kind of the popular thinking is it's not possible, that if you're a whistleblower, your life is destroyed. And there are great risks in being a whistleblower, but that's not always true. And they should explore. As far as responsible organizations, I would tell them that survey after survey shows that people within your organizations know about wrongdoing. And the question is, why aren't they telling you? And the answer is culture. And the organization should focus on establishing a culture of integrity where people feel safe to speak up. And when people do speak up, they need to be taken care of, even when they're wrong. Because organizations tend to think about people who speak up in the context of they're wrong, they're crazy, they have a motive, there's something. But if your organization tells people to see something and say something, then when people speak up, you should ensure that they are safe and appreciated.
That is such an incredible message. I have found, and I talk about this with Tom Mueller, that we want folks to come forward, but then when they do, they are essentially escorted out of the organization or pushed out of the organization. And the message that sends is shut up and don't say anything. And so it's very counterintuitive. It's good glossy marketing. So that message is really a great one, and I'm glad that you shared it.
I'm sorry, just one.
No, please go ahead.
The number one thing that leads people to report externally is when the tie between the organization is broken. And the number one way that happens is retaliation or the perception of retaliation. And so when you describe the counterintuitive way in organizations deal with things, so someone sees something, says something, and then they perceive they're retaliated against, the organization thinks, well, we've cleaned up the problem. You've actually put fuel on the fire, because that's what leads them to come to me.
That's a very important point to underscore. Nothing makes an employee seek out an attorney other than feeling that they're being harmed or wronged. A lot of these folks are coming forward because they're trying to do the right thing by the organization. And then the tables are turned on them internally. And so I'm glad that you pointed that out. I wanted to take a moment and just share with folks that we've been running across the bottom here, the banner for your organization. It's SEC Whistleblower Advocates. We've got a telephone number for you folks and a website, which is secwhistlebloweradvocate.com. So if they want to learn more information about you, or they want to learn more information about this area of law, they can go there. I took a look at that website, and it's a wealth of information. So I hope people check it out. Attorney Jordan Thomas of the SEC Whistleblower Advocates. Thank you for sharing your expertise. It was an absolute honor to have you here, and I want to thank you for making the time.
Of course. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to hearing Tom's remarks soon.
Sounds great. Thank you. So that was a lot to think about. My next guest also gives us a lot to think about, and his name is Tom Mueller. He is a freelance writer whose work has been read in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and he is the writer of 2 incredible best-selling books. His first book is Extra Virginity, The Sublime and Scandalous World of Olive Oil, and his second book is Crisis of Conscience Whistleblowing in the Age of Fraud. Now, Tom lives in Italy, and he is hopefully very much asleep by now. It's 4 a.m., around a little after 4 a.m. his time. He has told me that he is not a morning person, but he was gracious and kind and committed to meet with me for an interview that we pre-taped. I want to forewarn folks that as you watch this footage, there are 2 cuts that I made to the footage. Tom was a bit under the weather, and I made a decision to edit out only those human moments we all have. I also planned for a shorter interview, but frankly, the conversation with Jordan Thomas was just simply so good that I didn't want to edit it. And I wanted you to have the benefit of his thoughts. So if my technology works for me, I'd like you to watch. Thank you for joining us here on Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy. I really appreciate you stopping by.
Great to be here, Tracy. Thank you.
So what led you to focus on writing on corruption and whistleblowing?
I got going in whistleblowing through chance. I stumbled into a law called the False Claims Act, which is a fascinating legal palimpsest based on American pragmatism and a good dose of medieval magic. And basically, it's a law that was passed during the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln to prevent defense contractors from robbing the fledgling Union armed forces blind. And you'd be amazed that defense contractors tried to rob the U.S. Army and Navy blind, but it still happens, and it was happening back in the 1860s. And this law basically says, if you come forward, whether you're a perpetrator or someone with inside information who's innocent, if you come forward with information that can help us prove contractor fraud, we will give you a piece of the action. We'll give you a bounty. And in this law, in addition to the monetary incentives, they also had a key clause called the qui tam clause. And qui tam is Latin, and this is the medieval magic part. It's Latin for a phrase that goes, "He who sues in this matter on his own behalf and on behalf of His Majesty the King." So it's basically a private attorney general provision where an individual citizen with information on harm that's being done to the U.S. government can become a private attorney general and sue on his or her own behalf and on behalf of all fellow American citizens, even if the Department of Justice decides not to join the suit. And again, get somewhere between 15 and 30% of the reward if you win. So I was fascinated by this law, and I was fascinated by the people who were kind of the leading practitioners of the law. And I began to, follow their stories, meet their whistleblowers. And then I began to see how other whistleblower laws were kind of branching out from this original root system. SEC whistleblowers, aircraft and automobile industry whistleblowers, whistleblower hotlines, and of course in the realm of military intelligence and the military. There's always, it seems to be the go-to answer for the U.S. Congress at this point. If there's a major new corruption scandal, the first thing they do is say, well, let's pass a whistleblower law to fix this. And it's this classic public-private partnership that Reagan made famous and has been popular ever since. And it really works. It's by far the False Claims Act right now is by far the Department of Justice's most powerful tool in rooting out fraud, because you have an insider, someone who knows what's going on because they work there, telling you what's going on. But gradually I began to realize that the False Claims Act, these SEC, CFTC, and other financial whistleblower legislation and other had certain things in common. I mean, certain whistleblower characteristics in common, and that ultimately relying on these special people called whistleblowers to make sure that the justice prevails is a very risky proposition and an unfortunate position for our society to be in.
So in the last administration, I refer to that kindly as an administration, we heard the term leaker a lot. And so what is the difference between a whistleblower and a leaker? Is there one?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, a leak is, generally speaking, an unauthorized disclosure of confidential information. Maybe that's classified information, maybe it's less restricted in nature, like internal business reports or privileged legal documents, but it's still claimed to be sensitive. And the leaker is usually anonymous when they make the information public. And typically they tend to remain anonymous, a leaker. Whereas a whistleblower, well, whistleblowing is a subset of leaking. A whistleblower makes a leak, an unauthorized release of confidential information. The main differences are that the aims of the whistleblower or leaker in making that information public are quite different. And the public perception of those two categories, whistleblower and leaker, generally speaking, and there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the whistleblower does what he or she does for the good of society, to reveal waste, fraud, abuse, threats to public safety, and other forms of government or corporate wrongdoing. And their disclosures therefore meet a higher moral standard than those of leakers. Leakers, on the other hand, may well release their data to serve the public good in mind, or they may be releasing data to manipulate or control media coverage of a given event, put a certain spin on a story that's going to get out anyway, harm political opponents. And again, leakers typically remain anonymous throughout, whereas whistleblowers, their identity at some point in the process quite often is a major asset in driving home their claims and making sure that people understand just how wrong the conduct is that they're bringing out. I mean, sometimes the facts and the documents that they've released speak for themselves, but often a whistleblower's identity as an insider, as a subject matter expert, will allow them to explain the true meaning of the information to the public in a way that's compelling, and it gives their revelations a whole new power.
So you've steeped yourself in this topic and in this subject matter, and you've talked to or interviewed more than 200 whistleblowers. Is that right? Yeah. What were some patterns that you noticed in both the whistleblowers and the organizations that they were exposing, or the issues that they were exposing in those organizations?
Right. Well, I mean, it's difficult sometimes to say in absolute terms what whistleblowers have in common, because obviously I was only working on the basis of whistleblowing stories that I became aware of that were publicly or privately available. So I may also have been drawn to a certain kind of whistleblower or whistleblower story. Having said that, I did notice certain characteristics that many of them had in common. One is that they're senior enough to have a fair bit of self-confidence about their profession, about what's right and wrong. Excuse me. One point is that they're typically senior enough, these whistleblowers, to know what's right and wrong, and to have enough confidence in their own professional opinion to say, no, actually, we're breaking the law here. They're not new hires who are just learning the ropes. Typically, they've gotten into a situation with a fair bit of background. And at the same time, they're not so senior that they're part of the C-suite. They're not into the groupthink. They don't have massive financial incentives to look the other way. Many of the people that I interviewed had a very strong professional ethic about, this is how I do the job. This is what I signed on for. I'm a nuclear engineer, and part of my code that I'm legally obligated to follow is I don't let a mushroom cloud form over my work site. Or I'm a compliance professional, and compliance means certain very clear things that are written in this book that I can show you. So they're kind of, their enemies call them sticklers or inflexible, and I call them ethical. They're following the rules, and they're offended when people ask them not to or to look the other way. And a related theme, and this is again someone who. Donna Bushy, who is a fantastic woman and a great nuclear engineer out in the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Eastern Washington. She said, I'm a rules-based girl. I'm a black and white kind of person. I think things are either right or wrong, radioactive or clean. And so, when people said, could you just be a little more gentle in this report? You don't need to report that. And she said, oh yes, by section 42, subsection 3, paragraph 7, I am required by law to report this because it's illegal. And the more people push them to be flexible, in other words, to bend or break the rules, the more they react by saying, no, I'm obligated to do this. And then you run into the point at which they decide to break with, because typically whistleblowers come forward and say, everyone's going to be happy here. I'm protecting the reputation of my organization, which I care a lot about. I mean, contrary to public opinion, to widespread reports often spread by the organizations themselves, whistleblowers are not traitors. They're quite the reverse. They have the best interest of their organization at heart. And so they come forward thinking, I'm going to save everyone an enormous amount of pain here. I'm going to protect my boss and the whole chain of command, and I'm doing the right thing. But when the organization turns against them, they find a higher authority as the justification for going ahead with what they're going to do. Because, the easiest thing to do is just resign, move on. I'm not good with this, but I'm not gonna make a big fuss and destroy my career in the future. I'm just gonna retire and find another job. Well, whistleblowers are not good with that. They need to fix this, and so they find a higher authority, which could be, their duty to society. That could be their duty to their God, their duty to the nation. But sooner or later, they will mention a higher cause that they decided to serve. And then two other things that I've noticed again and again is the way in which they describe what they've done. And this is really for me, it was very moving because I heard it again and again. And one is human empathy. I mean, they'd say, hey, what if your brother was living on that, next door to that nuclear site, and there was a substantial chance of an explosion? How would you feel? What if your mother was living there? And then they'd also say, I had to do what I had to do. I had no choice. I had to, look myself in the mirror every morning. One woman said, I couldn't put my kids to bed at night without doing what I did. So again, a lot of these things come probably after the fact, after they've digested the horrible meal that whistleblowing ultimately is for most people. But also they are people who really couldn't live with themselves if they didn't do what they considered to be the right thing.
One of the things that struck me about the book was just the sheer number. And, in some ways, it made me feel like, this is every organization. I mean, just everything that you can think of. And that there isn't an ethical organization out there. Is that obviously isn't what you want folks to take from the book, but was it your sense that this is just widespread? These issues?
Tracy, that's a very good question. My initial interest was in this one corner of whistleblowing And then I began to look at whistleblowing more broadly. And then I began to think, well, whistleblowing is not actually all that special, because all the whistleblowers keep telling me I was just doing my job. So in a weird sort of way, I started with the yin and ended up with the yang. What is causing whistleblowing? This widespread normalization of wrongdoing. And to see the effects on the human spirit of working in a large bureaucratic environment with a really powerful transcendent corporate culture and a strong profit motive. I mean, the way in which I entitled my book Crisis of Conscience, because the way in which an individual conscience can be suppressed and replaced with our team's good, then the common good disappears and the team is going to prevail. That's something that more and more, as I looked at it, the vast majority of people go with the flow. They like to be part of the team. They fear being excluded. And it's only these individuals who, for whatever reason, are able to resist that gravitational pull, or are a little more prickly and not so, life of the party. And so they don't go with the flow because they don't like where the flow is going. For whatever reason, these individuals stand up and say, no, this is wrong. And they are instantly attacked in a really disturbing way. I mean, it's almost like a biological reaction. It's like a wolf pack that suddenly realizes that one of its members is sick and they turn and attack it, or it's almost like an immune response to a pathogen that the system, the organization, turns in a really visceral way against the person who, again, quite often says, "Hey, I'm helping here. I'm making sure we don't break the law." And they start the process thinking everyone's going to celebrate what I'm doing, and at the end find out that that the organization has its own as a conscience of its own that's very different from an individual conscience.
One of the things that struck me was the way Facebook handled their whistleblower that recently came out, and it was instantaneously they had a PR person take to the television and attack this woman. And if I remember correctly, one of their initial response strategies was that she stole the information. And I thought to myself, how, from a PR perspective, you're placing yourself in the crosshairs here. The public isn't happy with you in the first instance. The Congress folks aren't happy with you in the second place, and you're gonna attack this woman rather than just maybe be silent and let it move forward. It just seems almost like a playbook, if you will. I know that's a term that you've used, but that they can't help themselves. They have to go after that person.
Absolutely right. And I see it time and time again. I've seen it play out in a brutal way, not only for the individual whistleblower, but also for the organization. I mean, they could save themselves a world of hurt by listening to what this person is saying and replying appropriately, or simply remaining silent, as you said. And instead, when you can't handle the message, kill the messenger. That's the classic reaction. And, it may be effective in the long run because you do disincentivize, to say the least, a lot of people who are watching. And frankly, 99% of the organization is sitting on the fence. They're looking and waiting to see how this plays out, and they'll decide whether they'll speak up. And if they watch someone get publicly, attacked and humiliated, they'll probably give it a pass. So that it is part of the playbook, but at the same time, the organization overreacts in a really, again, a visceral, almost biological way that ultimately is really against the greater interests of the organization in terms, cynically, of damage control, and more broadly and more big-heartedly trying to fix things that are broken. I mean, that's ultimately what a whistleblower tries to do. And frankly, if an organization of the size of Facebook knows that the facts that this person has presented are wrong, that person will disappear without a trace. There will be nothing left of that person, digital or physical, by the time that corporation gets through with them. So the fact that they're still floating there, is struggling, but still in the public eye after about 30 seconds means that there's some there, that there is in fact a great deal, because otherwise they have an army, a phalanx of lawyers that will come in and destroy them. And we're done. You won't hear their name anymore. That's it. So if they're still there, that means that they have to go to plan B. That's destroy the messenger.
There's two things that are surprising to me about how this stuff works. One is that people are recruited into an organization under guise of diversity, thought diversity. But once you get there, there's this expectation that you shed that diversity and you become part of the cyborg, if you will. And stepping out of line is frowned upon. It's sort of like, don't go against the family. And then the second thing here is that organizations are regularly messaging, we want you to come forward. We want you to tell us when you see something wrong. But then when you do it, either there isn't a response, it's not adequate, or it's denied or not investigated. And that forces the person to step outside the organization to try to remedy the problem. And these ironies exist. What for you was the most surprising information that you learned in your work on whistleblowing?
Well, Tracy, I think you've really nailed it, that there's this disconnect between the PR and the reality of working at many organizations. And again, I want to underscore that, the basis, the stories in my book are the horror stories. I mean, the worst case scenarios where everything goes nuclear, literally or figuratively, and have a whistleblower. I'm sure that in many cases, someone, raises his hand and says, boss, I think, actually look at this, I think we're breaking the law. And the boss says, oh yeah, let's fix it. And they fix it and it goes away. That's the way it should work. And I'm sure it happens all the time, but there is this visceral sense of loyalty and obedience that we hear again and again. But I mean, I have never been so struck by the power of loyalty and obedience as listening to these whistleblower stories, where again and again and again, someone, the PR is, yeah, we want a diversity of ideas, and please tell us when we're not doing the right thing. And by the way, we have this compliance manual that's this thick, as Enron did, follow the rules. We're a good corporate citizen. All this bullshit, all this institutional hypocrisy, floating above this, the way the game is really played, the insider baseball, approach to our corporation, our industry. Here's how the game is really played, and it's signaled by these things that are never written down. How the CEO and the C-suite behave, the sorts of jokes that are made at public gatherings, which is the opposite extreme. It's like mafia jokes and stuff that are completely the opposite of the clean, squeaky clean PR that many organizations want to portray. And the way in which justice and ethics as the banner and loyalty and obedience as the reality just seem for most people just to kind of be. There's a great quote called Moral Mazes, a great book called Moral Mazes that describes this disconnect between how people ought to behave and how people really are expected to behave in the workplace. And this poor this poor executive says, the right thing to do at work is not what the right thing at church or the right thing in your family at home. It's what your boss tells you to do. That's the right thing. That's doing the right thing. And frankly, that's kind of the way it is. And whistleblowers are those few people who say, I can't stand this institutional hypocrisy. I can't stand the cognitive dissonance that I'm facing here. I have to speak up. And again, so often they think at the beginning of their process, they think everyone will be happy, everyone will applaud. And it's only when they get the pink slip that they realize, whoa, wait a second, what just happened there? And they realize that the scam that they are reporting was actually dreamed up by someone, 4 levels up on their org chart.
In looking at this, I have always tried to believe that, up at the very top, there's these pristine views of sort of, a message or an action that is well-meaning. And then what happens is it filters down through these levels of bureaucracy and it ends up getting tainted. But it doesn't seem that that's the case. I mean, there are problems at the very top where they're directing, inappropriate behavior, illegal conduct. And there's also these things that happen sort of in middle management. So it doesn't seem like it's an easy issue to define across organizations. Is that what makes it hard to solve?
Yeah, I mean, certainly within any bureaucracy, there's a wonderful book by Herbert Kellman called Crimes of Obedience, and he looks at the ways in which bureaucracies atomize wrongdoing into simple steps. So you never see that the little, metal casing that you're making is eventually filled with gunpowder, and then there's a poison charge added to it, and then it's shot into a crowd. You never see what happens to that little thing on your assembly line. So that, breaking up wrongdoing into small pieces where you don't understand, you're selling toxic mortgages, but you never see actually what happens when people, are foreclosed on and have to live in the street. But at the same time, I mean, tone at the top is the name of the game for corporate wrongdoing. When there's a massive, financial fraud of one sort or another, it's almost invariably launched and hatched and maintained in the C-suite. And when there's a toxic culture that causes an organization to go off the rails, it's almost invariably, enforced by the CEO, the C-suite. So, yeah, again, it's the right thing. What's the right thing? If there's a shareholder value argument that says that as a corporation, and this is, this is Harvard B School, this is a Chicago School of Economics, this is, if your only responsibility as a corporation is to maximize your profits, and that actually thinking as a good corporate citizen is a dereliction of duty, A, you're only going to think about profits, and B, what a relief. Now I can just focus on money. I don't even have to think whether this is the right thing or not. But that's real. I mean, that's, Milton Friedman won the bloody, Nobel Prize in economics for that crap. And that's destroying society, but it's great news, right? Like, I'm on Wall Street, I work at Goldman, and I used to, so nobody's perfect. And you're telling me I don't have to worry about, and I shouldn't worry. I must not worry about anything but profits. Beauty. I'll do that. And let it fall where they may. And then, the Chicago School will tell you that, oh, by the way, lawsuits and legal and criminal charges are merely disincentives that Congress has put in place. So, roll the dice. You have to pay $1 billion in fines. You still made $7 billion with your poisonous pharmaceuticals. So, we've been taught that this is noble, that this is free enterprise, and it's sadistic and dangerous. And we see the result. I mean, we see the result in our society. We are not in a good place.
I practiced law for almost 20 years, and I very much believed in the system. I still do, to a degree. A little more cynical now, but I was cynical before. But this idea that filing lawsuits and holding organizations accountable, will ultimately lead to a better behaving, world. And I don't know. I'm not seeing it. I mean, basically, they're settling out of court. In one of the stories that you talked about, or one of the folks that you mentioned, he ended up with very little money at the end. There were, criminal charges were being, either pled out or dismissed. And I think it was Mr. Jones, it might have been. But he was left with very little money at the end of the day and a tiny cabin in the woods. And so I'm just not seeing, the accountability and how accountability can happen here. And I don't know if that's how you felt as you were writing this, or whether you have some hope with respect to, you know, how lawyers like Jordan Thomas can make a difference?
It's an extremely good question, and one that you should definitely ask Jordan Thomas. I came away with a great admiration for the mechanism of the False Claims Act and the SEC whistleblower provision and a bunch of other whistleblower provisions, but the great skepticism about the legal settlement as a way of reaching serious social change. I mean, the number of chain reaction lawsuits, false claims and otherwise, brought against pharmaceutical companies, banks, for the same misconduct. Again and again, military contractors, the same misconduct. You find out what the scam is, you turn the crank, the transaction happens between, so say you have, like in Alan Jones's case, you have Johnson & Johnson selling a very dangerous substance, risperidol, pushing it on widows and orphans, and I mean that literally, in Texas, and making billions of dollars, okay? They settle for a sizable amount of money with him in Texas, and then multi-billion-dollar settlement on the national level. At the same time, they've made many times that much money on risperidol. They continue to make that money. And the transaction is between the pharmaceutical company, the Department of Justice, and the whistleblower. The people actually harmed in this never enter the discussion. The people who were over-medicated or under-medicated or wrongfully medicated, who died, there are bad things happening to people. They are not getting any airtime at all. And the settlement is simply hush money. I mean, quite often you sign the settlement agreement, you sign a non-disparagement, an NDA, you cash your check, and you move on. The company pays that out of, writes it off on their taxes, or they charge it to their shareholders and move on. And everybody celebrates, and their stock price goes up. And this is not called justice. This is not fixing the underlying problem. It's a good structure. It's a good start. But the legal settlement as standard procedure, that needs to change if we're going to actually change society with lawsuits.
Now, what do you think the biggest misconception is about whistleblowers?
Many people think, well, two that come immediately to mind. First, they think whistleblowers are snitches. They are traitors. They are going against their organization. And again, time and time again, I had whistleblowers tell me, I found this thing, and I said, thank God I found it, and I'm going to be able to bring it to the attention of my bosses, and we fix it so that the New York Times doesn't publish on this. I'm saving my organization a world of hurt. And they find out otherwise in due course, but only after they've, so they are the loyal people. At the same time, society thinks that whistleblower stories end like whistleblower films, that after about 2 hours of, suffering and a little bit of tension and, maybe your marriage is in bad shape, you walk out of there with a boatload of cash and everyone's smiling and everyone's applauding. And it just doesn't work that way. Even the winners, even the people who pocket enormous amounts of money are left with broken lives. They're left with broken careers where they can never work again. They're left with a sense of deep, abiding injustice, that right is wrong and wrong is wrong. I mean, that Orwell has had his way in their organization and their industry. And people don't realize that, blackballing is a real thing. Now, with Jordan Thomas's clients who are anonymous and remain anonymous throughout, if everyone does their job correctly and they remain anonymous, that's not a problem because their name never comes up. But for the vast majority of whistleblowers who are not on an anonymous program, sooner or later they're going to come out. And even if they're wealthy, they'll never work again. And that, to me, is a huge indictment. I mean, how can we allow systematic blackballing in an organization? If you were proved vindicated by a court of law, and yet no one will touch you, and that's standard procedure, you will never work again. You better find a new occupation. That's broken. And society and the normal person accepts that. They think, oh, well, they made a big cash out. And most people, by the way, don't. Most whistleblowers don't make any money at all. They lose everything. But even the ones who make a lot of money, they're left with a sense of injustice that never heals. So, yeah, this sense that somehow in the public eye that whistleblowers are disloyal is completely wrong. But that they somehow game the system and win the lottery, that's totally wrong. And we need to fix both of those. And I think, we need to look at corporate behavior and corporate accountability and say, you can't blackball someone because they told the truth. You can't do that. I mean, that's broken.
And indeed, that to me, as a lawyer, having negotiated agreements, one of the first things that the organization asks for is that you resign from the organization if you happen to still be working there, or that there's a non-disclosure agreement. Now, California just enacted a law that prohibited because harassment and discrimination are often alleged in line with a lot of these things, because the response from the organization is to behave even more badly.
Right.
And so California just enacted a law that added harassment, not just sexual harassment, to the types of cases that non-disclosure agreement didn't apply to. So at least California is leading the way with things like that. But it also disincentivizes settlement, which can be good for the whistleblower and the organization if done properly. Now, my wheelhouse is investigations. I'm one of those folks that you're supposed to come to tell, and that I'm supposed to look into the problem that you're bringing to our attention. And having followed all the discourse in that environment, one of the refrains we've heard in the Me Too movement, for example, is that no one would make these allegations unless they were true, because of what happens to them, as you've talked about, and the risks and consequences that they face. But what I have noticed is that the same isn't said about whistleblowers. For example, no one has ever said, believe employees. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, at-will employment is as a way of thinking in America. The boss is always right, ultimately. I mean, it is a fascinating comment in the middle of the Cold War in the 1960s by the president of Ford Motor Company, whose name escapes me. And he said in an unguarded moment, democracy is great. We should definitely follow democracy. But how are we supposed to learn it if our families, our schools, our churches, our workplaces are all totalitarian dictatorships? And it's a fair point.
Why do you think that they don't? That you never hear believe employees versus believe women. Women are employees too, but believe employees is something that I have never seen. I've never seen a hashtag that says believe employees, unless, for example, I'm the one that put it out there. And so I'm just curious about, how does that change, or should it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think that, you have to admit, you have to recognize, as all good whistleblower lawyers recognize, that a certain percentage of the people that come to them are wrong. They may be wrong in good faith. They may be gaming the system and seeing if they can't get a good settlement. They may be trying to get back at their boss. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't disqualify the concept of coming forward with information that is potentially important for the public interest. And the fact is, if you're taking on your employer, and your employer is a large corporation, you better have all your facts straight. You will probably lose even if you have all your facts straight. But if you don't, they will find the holes in your argument, and they will drive a Sherman tank through it. So, the fact that people challenge major organizations and remain in the public discourse for more than about 30 seconds suggests that there's some there. That there is, in fact, a body of evidence that supports their allegations about wrongdoing by that organization. Because otherwise, the phalanx of lawyers from the corporation would take them on and take them to pieces, and you'd never hear them again. So I think it's fair to assume that, you know, we should take seriously, aside from the fact that the law says we should, and then we must take seriously the warnings of an insider who says, look, no one else will know this. No one else is going to know this because I'm inside this organization, but I'm telling you there's a problem here. Now, again, if maybe they're wrong, okay, then the corporation can defend itself and point out, well, technically, yes, but in the bigger picture, that's not wrongdoing. Fine, I'm game for that. But the all-out assault on the character of the whistleblower just to shut them up and to intimidate anyone else from coming forward, that's where we get into bully tactics and dangerous territory. And as you say, I mean, listen to the employer. I would think logically that would. Are you restarting or?
I
would think logically employees would want to have that early warning system. They would want to listen to people who are saying, you know, I think this is legal, because maybe they get heads up about some problems. Usually, again, the loyalty and the obedience thing tend to choke out any kind of conversation.
And I could be wrong about this, given my sort of perceptions, you know, over time, but it seems as if whistleblowing was seen more negatively in the past, whereas it seems as if the tide is turning on that a bit. And where I get that from is sort of the difference between somebody like Snowden and somebody like the Facebook whistleblower, and others that have come forward recently, where the public has embraced them. Now, it could be their alignment with whatever the particular issue is, or their political alignment. But do you think that there has been more of a public embracement of whistleblowers as helpful and good and positive for society?
I think there's definitely been a sea change in the acceptance of whistleblower as a positive character in society, someone who speaks out on behalf of David against Goliath and protects the public good. And this started in the 60s with Daniel Ellsberg and Frank Serpico and Karen Silkwood, these sort of historic whistleblowers in the public interest, trying to end the Vietnam War, trying to end NYPD corruption, trying to, you know, save us from nuclear disasters. These are really important topics, and again, working in highly secretive organizations and areas of the government where only the insiders will know the truth. That said, the treatment of whistleblowers to this day, laws have proliferated, offering incentives. It's easier to win a case as a whistleblower now, and you have a wider range of options. But the overall support of the society, of the corporation against the whistleblower. We say we're for the underdogs. We say we're for David against Goliath, but then we bet on Goliath every time. We do not insist. We accept without questioning that an industry can take a whistleblower who has proven his or her allegations in a court of law and blackball them forever, end their career, potentially end their marriage, end their lifestyle, completely turn their world upside down. We accept that. In Hollywood films, there's a very different outcome. But in reality, we have a lot more work to do to make sure that whistleblowing whistleblowers get a fair shake for the risks they take, and ultimately rewards are nowhere near what they are led to believe.
My last question to you is, do you have any other books in the works?
Ooh, I can't talk about that. Healthcare fraud. Yeah, no, unfortunately I can't, but soon.
Soon.
Yeah.
So for folks watching, If you haven't picked up a copy of Tom's books, Extra Virginity and the Crisis of Conscience, I urge you to do so. I can say that, Tom, you have a way with description and words that's masterful. And I hope that when you publish your next book, you'll come back and see us again. Tom Mueller, the author of Extra Virginity and Crisis of Conscience, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Tracy. It's been a pleasure.
I am extremely grateful to Tom, all the way from Italy and under the weather, for sharing his thoughts to my many questions. It was an absolutely delightful conversation to have. At the top of the show, I shared some thoughts with you that bear repeating. The word whistleblower is unartful. It conjures an image of a phys ed teacher wearing a polo shirt emblazoned with their name, standing in a gymnasium, surrounded by students. The fluorescent lights above, the buzz they create, an ambient, normalized, and undetectable sound, surrounded by chaos, screaming, children's laughter, balls whizzing back and forth, and the teacher raises the red or silver or black whistle still hanging from a lanyard around the teacher's neck, part of the unofficial uniform. The lips part and grasp the familiar tool. They exhale forcefully. The whistle produces a shrill, high-pitched squeal, signaling to everyone in earshot to stop and listen. It commands. It's obeyed. Whistleblowing is not this. It is never this. It is quiet, secretive, done with careful deliberation, and isn't done immediately. There is a wringing of hands, self-doubt, the listing of a parade of horribles, sleepless nights. When whistleblowing appears in the news, it is a moment where it's usually heroism that is being recognized. For the whistleblower, like the veteran returning from war, the internal thoughts and feelings aren't consistent with other perceptions of you. Whistleblowing aligns with feelings of insecurity, fear, resentfulness, anger, and most of all, burden. The heavy, unshakable burden. The burden of knowledge and what that knowledge means. The burden of being unable to look the other way, or worse, take part. The image of a person sitting under hot lights in front of a legislative body, telling the world their story, is what whistleblowing produces. It is not the act itself. Whistleblowing is necessary. So are people like attorney Jordan A. Thomas of SEC Whistleblower Advocates and investigative journalists like Tom Mueller, author of Crisis of Conscience and Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. Now, if you're interested in more of Tom's analysis, there is so much more in his book, and I urge you to grab a copy. Run, don't walk. Like, get on Amazon, like right now. I bought my copy. It wasn't a gift, and I was happy to do it. I didn't even ask for a free copy. This was, for me, an incredible opportunity to have two wonderful conversations with people who are brilliant. This is the best gig, I swear. Now, I said at the top of the show I had a great week. I didn't just get the opportunity to interview Tom Mueller and Jordan Thomas. I had the fortunate opportunity to be a guest legal analyst on Court TV. So keep your eyes peeled. You never know where I'm going to turn up. Next week, we're going to have another great show for you. We're planning on discussing bioethics and COVID. I hope that you will please join us. Thank you for joining us this evening. I wish you a good night and a great tomorrow. Thank you.